John McGuinness, you have almost.
I too welcome the bill, and I welcome the various changes that will support the consumer and indeed the definition of financial services. But we have to reflect on just exactly what happens. Amalgamating an office, putting this legislation into place, is only one step in the right direction. The next step is how serious the Ombudsman will take up the legislation and implement the various parts of that legislation. And in the past we have seen that we are almost as a country incapable of regulation. And we have to reflect on what happened in the banks and other financial institutions during that collapse. We had legislation in place. We had an ombudsman in place. We had the regulators in place. And yet, when it came to it, there was no risk manager ever challenged within the banking system about whether or not they saw anything going wrong in the banks that they should have reported to the regulator or to the central bank. And I still pose the question, as many do, what action was ever taken to find out if risk managers ignored the signs that were in the financial institutions during that time, to try and avert the collapse that happened and the burden of debt that was then heaped on the Irish citizens. Indeed, Jonathan Sugarman, in his evidence to the Committee of Finance, made it perfectly clear that he and his superiors went to the central bank, that the complaint was made, was lodged, and was never followed up. And look at the banks that went bust. Look at the rescue package that had to be put in place. And still no one has answered the central question. What did the risk managers do relative to the legislation and their obligations at that time? And judging from central bank reports, we have to ask ourselves the very same question now. Are there practices going on in the banks that give rise to the concern that was shared by others back over the years relating to the activities of the bank? And when you move from the banks to the consumer and you see the number of complaints that have been made, for example, in relation to insurance. Property insurance has gone up, car insurance has gone up, truck insurance has gone up, the taxis complain bitterly. Indeed, I had a submission made to me by the taxis that service Dublin Airport, who say they come in and out of town at a general fee or charge of €20. And yet, against that, their monthly cost on insurance has risen from €100 to €150 to €290 per month. Now, where is the explanation for that? Where is the action of the regulator or the bank, central bank, in relation to the complaints that are being made? Why is it that people coming home from abroad can't get the cover or can't get their history recognised in terms of driving? Why is it that businesses throughout the country are threatened because of insurance costs? They can't afford them. The Minister has a report, the Finance Committee has a report, and yet nothing concrete has been done to reduce the costs. Any of the complaints made have not been held up, many of the complaints that have been made have not been processed to the extent that action is taken arising from that complaint. The pension funds the same way, and you could relate that to the ward of court funds. Who is going to monitor those funds? What responsibility will the Ombudsman or this office undertake to ensure, in reality, that the wrongs that we have experienced in the course of the deliberations of the Finance Committee are addressed? The consumer out there feels unrepresented, and there is a less than a convincing argument put forward by the central bank or those responsible in relation to consumer issues. In fact, when some of the tracker mortgage issues were raised with the banks, they did very little in the beginning. They did everything, in fact, not to address the issue. And now that the issue has been exposed and is being dealt with again through the Finance Committee, the banks are still doing their best not to take on the full responsibility. And there are individual tracker mortgage holders out there that still can't get themselves included in the review process, even though everything that's written down in their case would point to the fact that they should be in the process. We have had Ulster Bank with the Globalisation Redress Board, or redress scheme, and they have questions to answer. And yet, the commitments that they gave in relation to actions that they would take were never fulfilled. And they then use the power of their might to deal with the customers, and the customer again feels unrepresented. And I would point you to the recent Office of Director of Corporate Enforcement and what happened there. Why in the name of God did that happen? And look at all of the other regulators. Look at the regulator with the bank. Look at what happened. It seems that the citizen is shortchanged all of the time. And as soon as the banks and other institutions can get to their feet and get themselves covered, they again turn around and kick the customer. They don't observe the rights of a customer in most cases. And in fact, they pay, in general, lip service to the committee system in this House. And as a result of that, the customer does not get the rate that should be applied. The family that's concerned in that case, and many cases like it, are the ones that have to carry the brunt of poor administration in this country. We seem to be incapable or institutionalised to the extent that nothing matters, only the institution itself. And now, as we sell the shares in AIB and begin to release them from where they are now and public ownership, we're throwing further to the wolves those that are in debt in those banks and can't get to grips with it. And lastly, Lascian Cora, I want to point to the court system and the cases that end up there. The repossession courts are an absolute disgrace, and we have not addressed that problem. And as a result of that, there are thousands of cases poorly managed by the bank, ignored by regulators and ignored by anyone that took the complaints from the individuals concerned. And they are being forced, as citizens of this country, to go to court as defendants when the state has abandoned them in the first place. And that's the type of strong regulation that we need. We need strong regulation, we need strong legislation, and we need strong personalities, not to be afraid of the might of the banks, and to put the citizen at the centre of their thinking in relation to the implementation of this law, or indeed any other laws. And lastly, when you look back on the financial collapse, and you look at what was sold, and you look at the various accountancy organisations that stood over what was being sold, that stood over the poor regulation, that stood over the breaking of laws, and didn't regulate their own members, is it any wonder that we are where we are today?